So I don't want to make people wait too long, actually. So for those of you that are here, let's wait about another 30 seconds, and then we'll get started, and people can join later or watch the video. We'll post this back on our the Reimagining website. I'll make sure that the American Jewish Historical Society has it too. Hi, Diana. Oh, look, you used to work with the Tenement Museum.
Diana who?
Gomez.
Oh, who used to work at the Tenement Museum. Oh, hello. Right.
So, it's lovely, all the connections. And hi, Patty from Fairfax. Fantastic. You know, from my colleague Veronica Boyce-Vencia from Harvard Graduate School of Education and Project Zeros. Terrific. Thank you all for joining us. All right, so I'm gonna get us started. I'm really excited about this project. I think it's a project that we all knew was going to be really an important project, but I think that as news goes on, it continues to resonate in all kinds of different ways. I think I'll let Annie, go deeper until. Explain the context of the new Colossus, Emma Lazarus, and the Statue of Liberty. But let me, if I can, for just a moment, introduce Reimagining Migration. So, Chelsea, if you could go to the slide. So, actually, let me do this first, actually. So, here's some of the goals for tonight's webinar. Real simple, right? We want you to take away a classroom-friendly resource for exploring migration issues, and we do that because we think about immigration, but we're also thinking about migration, which is a broader story that includes stories of forced migration, where immigration is typically a story by choice, and also issues of refugees. So if we're exploring issues of migration, past and present, we'll learn a little bit about how Emma Lazarus' story can provide a really powerful model for civic engagement and the power of poetry to shape the way that people can think and behave. And then also, Annie will introduce an opportunity to engage your students as civic poets in a really cool national poetry contest. She's already getting great judges to be part of this as well. So we'll go over this in a little bit. So let me go to the next slide. So the agenda is pretty simple. Who's an introduction? Here's we'll talk about who we are. I'll introduce Reimagining Migration. You know what? This was the other. I'll spend just a second talking about some of our work. I'll introduce Emma, introduce Annie, and then we'll talk about where she'll talk about the American Jewish Historical Society and the Emma Lazarus Project, both modeling some material, but also helping teach some of the content a little bit, so we'll all know her story better. And then we'll do a little Q&A. Hopefully this will be an engaging hour. And so please stay active in the chat box. Chelsea waved, and Chelsea's monitoring it, and so she'll make sure that we're paying attention as things are going. So I'm Adam Strom. I'm the director of Reimagining Migration. And so Reimagining Migration is just actually an organization that's a couple of years old. It's a partnership between Harvard Graduate School of Education and UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Immigration Studies. And then our mission is to ensure that young people grow up understanding migration is a shared condition of our past, present, and future. I'm reading it now, right? In order to develop the knowledge, empathy, and mindsets that really sustain inclusive and welcoming communities. But really what we believe is that migration is our shared experience as humans. So when a story, let's click on to the next slide, when a story like the one in the Washington Post came out earlier this summer, looking at the Statue of Liberty and Emma Lazarus and a current news story, we believe that there's stuff underneath this that's part of our human experience that maybe people don't know. So I think what I would like you to do is in the chat box, when you read a headline like this, clearly he didn't take part in our curriculum. That's a quote from Annie.
That was at 1 in the morning, actually.
What's underneath a story like this? If you think about this as the top of an iceberg, and the story's the top of the iceberg, what's underneath? People just jump in with thought in the text box, in the chat box. So I'll just give people just a moment to share any thoughts you all have. You don't want me talking at you anyway the whole time. Hey, Molly. Molly Shen says different understandings of U.S. immigration, ignorance of history, misconceptions, bias, the idea of a single story of American immigration. Fantastic. What else, folks? And a bright fifth grader who couldn't believe her ancestors didn't live in the past, U.S. for several hundred years, right? So I think there's our own misconceptions about our own history as well as our own national histories, right? I think we have different understandings of this. So let's go to the next slide. So and sometimes deliberate, absolutely, and I agree with you, Molly. Sometimes absolutely. Cuccinelli, I don't know where that conversation is coming from. Some of the story about his own family history is quite interesting. He's a guy whose family really worked their way up, and did not come, as the kind of English-speaking immigrant that he seemed to be envisioning as who people are supposed to be coming today. So how deliberate, I don't know. But let's go to the next slide too, the one underneath that. But we really see that migration is really part of a through line of human history. People have been migrating, not immigrating maybe, but migrating since we first stood up. This is a through line of history. People have been migrating since before there were national boundaries, right? Before cities built walls, before anyone needed passports. This is really essential to the human condition. And reimagining migration, we really see this as our shared story as humans. And let's go to the next slide, Chelsea. Mm-hmm. And so, one of the things, if you look at the map right now, we know that there are about 1 billion people on the move. And that 1 billion people is thinking more about migration broadly because there are more people who are moving, within countries and across national borders. There are now about 272 million people living outside of the country in which they were born, but then they're, a little less than 750 million who are migrating within their country. And people are not just migrating from one place to the other. Historically, we've told stories about people migrating to particular countries as magnets. What you're looking at right now, we are a world on the move. And you can see the slide behind, people are moving from Asia to other parts of Asia, from Africa to other parts of Africa, to Europe, within Europe. And yes, there are people moving across the world too, but we're talking about 63 million people moving within Asia, but there's 17 million people from Asia moving to North America. So you can see the disparity, right? More people moving within the continent. So this is a much, much broader story of people on the move. Let's go to the next slide. And Annie's running around in the way.
No, I do people on the move.
And so part of this story we know is it's predictable that when large numbers of newcomers come, there's a backlash, right? This is a piece of art from Banksy, the British street artist, and it's predictable, right? So here we have the pigeon saying, "Migrants not welcome. Go back to Africa. Keep off our worms," and the sparrow, right, which is a migratory bird, being called out. Banksy, Deanna. It's a British artist named Banksy. And these toxic narratives, let's go to the next slide. We know it has an impact on people. I'm focusing on kids, but this is actually kind of a broader story that we know and I'm taking a number of studies here and I'm putting them all together, that it's a really negative impact on students' social and emotional well-being and their academic performance. And what we're actually finding is that the impact isn't just limited to immigrant origin kids, and by that I mean the children of immigrants. We know that this is actually impacting everybody across the spectrum. This politicized environment is shaking people up, including we're seeing, you all know the story, but increased acts of bullying within school. And actually the most common insult getting hurled, a slur, according to a recent study out of UCLA, is build the wall. So that language of immigration is being pulled into our language around bullying. So this otherizing becomes sort of acceptable in a toxic narrative, and it starts to reinforce prejudice. If you had a prejudiced idea where we're in a society when there's lots of othering, that starts to reinforce these ideas, and it legitimizes exclusion, and it really divides us. This is not good for democracy. So I think it's our job to start to think about how do we tell these stories and how do people put these stories into context when, especially in a moment where immigration and migration issues are so charged. So let's go to the next slide, if I could. So what we're doing is reimagining migration, and I'm doing this with, first of all, we're not doing anything alone. That's a bad idea. So we're doing this as much as possible with partners who are full of ideas, who can teach us stuff. So tonight there are people on the call, on the chat box I'm watching, who are partners and folks that we love to work with. And then there's Annie and Chelsea at the American Jewish Historical Society. And so let's go to the next slide. And without going too much further, what I want to say is that we really believe that these migration stories aren't just in little episodic moments to look into, but we should start to be thinking about how do we build curriculum as educators that recognize the through line story of migration, moving from our own stories, right, to starting to think about how our stories connect us, where there are opportunities for connection, where there are division, but how do we then move into a deeper and richer understanding of the migration experience, right? And part of that story is the way that societies respond to newcomers. And in some way, that's where I think Emma Lazarus' story picks up, is looking at how do you reframe the debate about migration in a particular place and time. So in some ways, she bridges the last two pieces of the Reimagining Migration learning arc, from understanding migration to taking action, because she understands the world she lives in and she wants to shape it. I'm shutting up now, and let me turn this over to Annie. And Annie, take the rest of it. Take the wheel.
Well, I'm actually the wheel is gonna be, I don't know if it's a good idea to have the metaphor of a wheel, but
Okay.
Chelsea and I are gonna steer together. But Chelsea Bracci, who's on the call, who has been working with me on this project for quite a while in various ways. And so what we're going to do today is tell you a little bit about why it got started, how you can access it, and the different ways that you can experience the curriculum, whether you want a one-day experience, whether you want a 3-day experience for your students, whether you just want the resources. So we kind of wanted to give you an overview, and we also really, really want to hear from you, your thoughts about how you might integrate this curriculum into your classroom. So in short, the Emma Lazarus project is curriculum, a poetry contest. There's a short film that's part of the curriculum and poetry contest. And it's also a physical exhibition that we're creating here at the Center for Jewish History in New York City, right off of Union Square. And so we'll talk about these different components. You don't have to take part in all the components, but all the most important components are the curriculum and the poetry contest. But because the Ken Cuccinelli story was brought up, I thought I would explain that a little bit, because it underscores the way in which our archives kind of come into, you can just leave, come into focus. You can go back. So that day, Ken Cuccinelli, who's the acting head of the Office of Citizenship and Immigration, had talked about a new proposal that would make it very difficult for immigrants who had received any kind of public assistance or assistance to become citizens. And reporters then, I think quite wisely, went to him and said, well, what about the Statue of Liberty? And what about give me your tired and your poor and your huddled masses yearning to breathe free? To which he responded, give me your tired, your poor, and those who can stand on their own 2 feet, which then, of course, sparked a whole storm of people going back and forth about this and what it means. And it really kind of underscores something we've said from the very beginning, which is if you Google give me your tired and your poor, you get like 256 million. And again, it changes every day. Sites or, clicks or hits. And so we know that these words are like in the public, and people are thinking about them, and they are quoted in small town newspapers, they're quoted in national newspapers, they're quoted on the left, they're quoted on the right, with various kind of ways of looking at it. But for whatever reason, this poem is important. Yet, no one knows who the author is, And our thinking has been, if we go into the context of who this author is, we're going to get more into the context of the poem itself, but also be able to underscore how a person makes a difference. And so Emma Lazarus was 5th generation American. She was not an immigrant. She did not have parents who were immigrants. She did not have grandparents who were immigrants. She did not have great-grandparents who were immigrants. But she developed this important relationship to newly arriving immigrants that then shaped her work. So we thought that actually starting with someone who was American to talk about immigration was an important starting point. And if you go back to the image with all the cluster, the kind of collage that we started with, I think you can see the different ways in which this curriculum is playing out. And so really, really quickly, the core of the curriculum are the primary sources we have here at our collection. We are the American Jewish Historical Society. We've been around since 1892. The society has, not me and Chelsea, but the society has since 1892, with the express goal of documenting American history and the diverse ways in which American Jews have participated in American life. We have 30 million documents and 50,000 books and lots of stuff. But you can say that over and over again. You can say the numbers, but it doesn't mean anything. But when you start to tell someone about a person and you have their quotes, you have their letters, that's what draws people in. That's been the experience I've had as a teacher or as an educator at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, where we tell, or we told, or they told, we told, whatever it is, the story of immigration through families, and could see how much people related to that. Coming here to this archive, I knew we had to personalize the story in some way, and Emma Lazarus, again, kind of emerges as a person to do this. So here at our archive, we have her documents, and we'll see a little bit of that in a second. So we have sources that you can see on this page. New York Times articles, we have her family's papers that go back to the 1700s. We even have her great-grandmother's book of poetry that she wrote. We have cartoons that document the anti-Semitism of the time. We have pro and anti-immigrant sentiments documented in our collection. So we have all of this stuff, and you can see at the bottom manuscript boxes. You can see kids in our archives, and we've been bringing kids into the archives to see what we have and to tell the story. But then, because we know not everyone can come to New York City, we've created a website that Chelsea will be going over as we proceed in the webinar. But there's just a short image of that on the bottom where you can see the different colored manuscript boxes, because we wanted to preserve that experience that students have of digging into manuscript boxes, the idea that they're their own historians, that there's a mystery that they can solve about who this Emma is. So that's something that we brought on. There's also a film that helps bring it together. So it's a curriculum, it's a film, it's an exhibition, but it's really about people learning about Emma Lazarus through primary sources. And then at the very end of it, there's a poetry competition. So the idea is to encourage students to submit poems to the prompt. If you could write a poem for the Statue of Liberty today, what would it say? And so that's what we have been working on, and we've done a pilot of this with about 200 something kids. And we've done professional developments, and so we're going into this next year with this idea of kind of really getting this contest going, and we'll announce the first winner in the spring, and the winner will be able to come to New York for a ceremony with other poets and all of that. So that's it in the nutshell. But as we go in, you can see really quickly in the next slide our stacks, and so we bring students into the stacks. And this is at the American Jewish Historical Society in New York, but also this is, you can go to Emma, that's fine. No, it's good. And then this is the book. I mean, and this is also, from my experience, when I've taken people through our archive, when we pulled out this book, and this was a book that was written in 1886 when Emma Lazarus was ill. She knew she wasn't well through her whole life. She was writing every day almost. And in her mid-30s, she becomes ill. It's what we now know as Hodgkin's disease. I don't know that she knew that, but she did know she couldn't write new poetry anymore. She didn't have the strength. So she has this manuscript book that we know from the inside cover she bought on 6th Avenue, just a few blocks from where we are right now, and a few blocks from her home on West 10th Street. And she writes her work in this book. She can't create new work, but she can start to recopy her work. She understands that now's the time to kind of leave her legacy. So she does this in 1886. So when I've taken this book out to show people, and we read it out loud, it kind of has the feeling of prayer in a way. Like I've seen how sacred people view this poem, but I've also kind of seen like people don't really know her story, or they don't know all of it, and we'll keep talking about it, but yet this resonates with people for some reason. And I wanted to take that power and explore it more. And so that's what kind of, again, initiated this whole Emma Lazarus project. How do we take this manuscript and several other boxes we have of her materials and create a story? And the next slide is, okay, so also one of the things I found in bringing people is that they knew "Give me your tired and your poor," and again, that was sacred to them, but they didn't know the whole poem. And so we realized, okay, we need to do something cool with this poem and we need to get it out. So we invited the artist Laurie Anderson, who you might remember from Superman. Does anyone remember Superman, or am I like too old? Let's see, chime in with your chats. And she was also married to, she's a widow of Lou Reed. So like here we have this kind of iconic New Yorker. What we did is we brought her to Emma Lazarus's home on West 10th Street. And the owner of the home is a wonderful man, Andrew Solomon, himself a writer, who really appreciates that he's living in Emma Lazarus's house. Like he's like a kindred spirit to her. So was very kind in letting us bring a film crew and Laurie Anderson into his home on February 14th, it was Valentine's Day, to film this. So this is just a short clip of her reading the poem, and I thought it would be helpful for us to kind of just listen to the poem for a moment. I can't hear it, but do they hear it? Oh. We can hear, yes, I can hear either. We're gonna
And her name,
If you turn down yours, Annie.
Mother of Exiles, from her beacon hand blows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor, the twin cities frame, keep ancient lands. Your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Okay, so that was Laurie reading, I think, part of the poem. And what we want to do now is actually look at the poem. And this is what this version is from our archive. And when I saw this image, I kind of fell in love with it. And we've kind of basically remade our logo to be this image. But this is, we believe, from the 1930s, and it was a reprinting of it. And I want to just take a second and have you read the poem. You can read it out loud to yourselves. That's totally fine. And in fact, I encourage it because I think you hear different things when you read it. So take a minute. Let's read the poem, and then I'm curious to hear your impressions of the poem and what it's like to kind of see it again like this. Yes, and please share any thoughts you have as you're reading the poem. Could be consensus to fourth grade, given that's such a, yeah, I think fourth grade.
So someone said, would Emma have been aware of Colossus, who depicted Shekhinah as mother of Kabbalah?
So there was a question about whether Emma would have known about Kabbalah and the idea of the Shekhinah, which is this protective force. I don't know. I don't know. She did study Hebrew language, but she was not studying Kabbalah. She studied more history. So she was studying the Crusades. She read Heinrich Gratz's book, A History of the Jews, when it comes out probably in German and then in French, because it doesn't come out till English till later. But she's working Jewish history into her poetry from a pretty young age. But I haven't seen any reference to her studying mysticism particularly. Were there any other questions about the context or the background?
Someone also said, it's interesting the emphasis she places on statue being a woman and not the brazen giant of Greek fame.
Yes. So someone has brought up the way in which the statue is clearly a woman, and that she's referred to consistently as a woman and also as a mother. And the image of a protective mother, someone just threw on. Absolutely, and I think that's very important. The brazen giant of Greek fame is a reference to the Colossus of Rhodes, which was a statue kind of depicting of strength and kind of imperialism in a way, with this conquering limbs. And she is saying, this is the new Colossus. This is not this brazen giant of Greek fame, but this is something else. So you have two contrasts. You have that, the contrast to the Greek fame, but you also have a contrast later on when she says, keep ancient lands, your storied pomp. I think that's a direct kind of way in which she's distinguishing America from Europe, which has its storied pomp. But America is fresh, maybe, in this conception at least, and doesn't have that.
Just Annie, as I'm reading, interesting what Molly's talking about is how, that rejection of the pomp, right, and how radical some of the imagery starts.
I didn't hear the rejection of what?
The pomp.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is a very bold. I think it's funny. I think the poem itself is brazen. It's brazen to be depicting a gentle America. I think in a way. And I can't read all of the. What does it say? My seniors and I recently read this poem while we were analyzing Cornelio. What does the rest of that say?
So Campos' piece, Art Guadalupe relay run, and then compared it to current events. They pulled out some of her word choice and how the imprisoned lightning takes on new connotations today.
So again, this is how a class had just studied the poem and really focused on imprisoned lightning, which is an interesting kind of, what is this imprisoned lightning? And I think, and again, I don't know, I'm not Emma. This is just from reading it many times and reading about her. I think there's something about the potential that she's alluding to, but that it's not quite fulfilled, perhaps. But what did your students think? I'm curious. So if we can jump to another person, but if you want to be sharing more what your students talked about with regard.
Emily asked that, just thinking about this idea of imprisoned, right? Playing with this idea in today's context. Natalie's saying something I think is interesting, right? And it picks up on what Molly's getting at, is this, it's interesting, a voice yet with silent lips. In this contrast, if you think of the political situation of women at a time, as she's saying, is a voice, but women did not have that political voice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is before the 19th Amendment.
Grade 6 students are studying this poem after reading Towers Falling by Jewel Parker Rhodes. And I was even thinking about Zeus's lightning, a punishment, and her capturing and her torch and keeping it from reaching the weary travelers.
Mm-hmm. So, it sounds as if she's great. So students are already, it's sounding from what I'm hearing, and even just like there've been like 3 or 4 examples of people already sharing work with their students in the classroom, but that the students seem to be responding to the poem and able to analyze it and in ways that are productive. Let me ask you this really quickly, and we'll move on, but how many of the students know about Emma Lazarus before the class? None.
Zero.
Even good. Okay, this is someone.
Oh, this is great.
Okay. Oh, someone said half. That's great. That's exciting. So what I can share from talking about Emma Lazarus to people every day for the last year and a half almost is that adults have a recognition of the name, and older adults in their 50s or 60s or 70s and above often had memorized the poem as part of their school curriculum. And then like kind of as you go younger, people know the poem and they know her, but they don't know that much about her. And then we did a class, for example, at Dalton, at New York school, with very like well-educated kids and New Yorkers. And they only one out of the 20 or something knew Emma Lazarus's name. So it's just, we're finding that even when people do know Emma Lazarus, whether teachers or students, they don't know that much about her. So what we started, and this is what we did it with a 6th grade class at Hunter Elementary that we worked closely with for a couple classes, and we worked with the teachers, is we asked the teachers to teach the poem without going that much into Emma's background. Basically, here's the poem. You know the Statue of Liberty, because that's where the entry point for the students are. They know the Statue of Liberty. They have it on snow mugs, or those things that you turn upside down. What are those called? Snow globes?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then they've had Statue of Liberty in that, or they like went to go see it. So they know Statue of Liberty, and they have a sense that the Gimme You're Tired and You're Poor is on that. But so then what we did was they studied the poem. And then we asked the students, based on their study of the poem, and all of this is in the curriculum that you'll see, write down questions they have about Emma. Okay, so then what we did is we took these questions. This is just one sample. We took the questions, went into our archives, and we pulled primary sources that help answer the questions. And we ended up dividing into 5, and in some cases 6 chapters, depending, and then put primary sources. We didn't put the real archival stuff in it because then the archivist would really, really strangle me. I love archivists though. Let me go on the record for saying I love archivists for preserving all of our paper, but what we wanted to do is make sure that this is getting to people. So we couldn't just give them some of the stuff. So what we did is we took the sources and annotated them and helped explain them a little bit, but still preserve the original on the page. So the students came in to the archives, they were able to pull out their boxes and sit in groups and go through it and answer questions and share. So here you can see the students with Melanie Myers, our director of collections and engagement, teaching kids. These are kids from like the Harlem Academy, a charter school in New York City, going on a tour of the archives. And then this is an example of the manuscript box. So one of the chapters was, there are many different ways to be Jewish. What did being Jewish mean to Emma? And it's interesting, this box was one that I thought maybe this is a group that we're just going to use for like the Hebrew school kids or the Jewish day school kids, but maybe for the public schools it's not relevant. But we tried it out and we found that kids actually really responded to this, even in schools where there weren't even any Jewish kids, because this question kind of got at more universal questions of identity and religion and whether you go to church or whether you like whatever it was. So we've kept it, and it's actually been like a popular box. But these are students. The students here are from nearby Hebrew school, and the student holding up her own poem that she also watercolored is from Hunter. So this is them bringing them into the archives and letting them explore through the primary sources the very questions they came up with. And then the next slide. So we know that not everyone can come here, although we really want people to come here. And one extra incentive for coming here we'll get to is that we'll have a physical exhibit that the kids can enter into Emma Lazarus's home, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you cannot come to New York, and I think a bunch of you on here are not from New York City, which means you live in bigger apartments, so you're lucky, but that you can access the same sources of which all are the core of the experience here on this website that we're going to talk about later, or we're going to talk about now.
I think we'll talk about it now.
We'll talk about it now, and Chelsea's going to talk a little bit more about the website.
Okay, and then if you can turn off your speakers.
Mm-hmm. Here?
Yep.
Right, because we're sitting in the same rooms. Okay, let's see. We need to end the show. So I'm going to take you over to, this is the website that Annie just showed you. And so we've kind of broken this down that you can take the experience that we had in the archives with the students and either have a one-day lesson experience, a 3-day lesson experience, or come and visit us. So just to quickly take you through, you actually get to pull one of these boxes off the shelf. And so this is inside the OneDay Box. And so you can see we've created a teacher guide for each. There's also the student materials, the presentation, and then also any videos that you need to use. This is the video that we watched of Lori Anderson. And so it was okay.
Totally kill my sound. I think that I did totally kill my sound, right? I guess there's an echo.
Oh, are we hearing an echo?
There, I don't hear it, but they're hearing an echo, right?
Oh, then maybe let's mute you.
Okay.
Is that better? Let's see.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Oh, good. And I'm not hearing myself anymore. Oh, that's so much nicer. Great. I could see on your face something was going on. And so for each of these, they're all downloadable and it'll walk you through exactly how to do it. The key piece of the one-day lesson that still allows students to get to feel like they're going into our archives is the 13-minute film we created through the project, really pulling from our archives and animating those sources. And so I wanted to show you just a quick piece of what that looks like. Close. By coming over here. And so this just shows you,
But in the more traditional sense of what it means to be an activist, I think that really gets going in the 1880s.
okay, let's see, there it goes.
Emma Lazarus responds to the arrival of many East European Jews who are coming in large numbers. They're fleeing in Russia, and the existing agencies don't have enough space to house these refugees as they arrive. And they're brought over towards Island in the East River, and Emma goes to visit them.
So that just gives you a really quick kind of idea of what this film looks like. And so that really pulls from our archives, is the core piece of that lesson. And then that gives the students a launching point for really them thinking about who Emma is as a person, an author, an artist, an activist, and then leads them into creating their own poems. So if you only have one day, because I know a lot of teachers do not have that much time to bring in lessons that aren't helping to teach to the test, sometimes that this is something you can do in one class period and then have them write poems as their homework assignment. If you have a little bit more time, which we hope you do, we have created a 3-day lesson that really helps them dive really deep into the poem, and then actually allows them to kind of actually open up their own manuscript boxes. And we've created an entire kind of guide to archival sources that we've pulled from our collections, but also from others' collections as well. We have a whole box dedicated to the archive sources. And so just to give you an idea, this is what we've designed for students. So they get a packet of sources. Give that a second to come up. There it goes, where they have these archivist notes. So essentially we're putting them in the shoes and empowering them to be their own historians, to create their own interpretation of these sources. But just like an archivist creates a finding aid, will annotate sources, we've put that kind of contextual scaffolding information with every source. And we've used it with multiple different groups at different levels and different grades. And they've all kind of been able to find their way of interpreting these sources. So this was that poetry book that Annie mentioned before, that belonged to Emma Lazarus's great-grandmother. So we've kind of pulled all of these different themes and chapters together from our collections, from others, including, I'll kind of keep going here, contemporaneous sources around immigration that are pro and anti, including this political cartoon that you saw animated in the film. So everything's kind of pulling from the same sources to give them as rich an experience as possible, and really helps them create their own conclusions, draw their own conclusions about these primary sources for themselves. And so that is the 1-day lesson and the 3-day lesson. But we also have created pre and post activities for those of you in New York City who could come visit us. And that illustration that you can kind of see in the background, that is the drawing that the exhibit is going to be based off of. So there is no plexiglass, there is no cases, there are no ropes. It is a room that students are able to go into and interact with and literally pick things up off the shelves. And there will also be a giant digital folio that is a storyteller basically in the center of the room that they can move through as well as a group, as a class, to really kind of experience what it'd be like to step into Emma's shoes as well as examine these primary sources with us here on site. And then we give you the materials you need to, before the lesson, set them up, but also then afterwards to go back to the classroom and inspire them to, well, if you could write a poem for the Statue of Liberty today, if you could be the next Emma Lazarus, what would you write today? And so that was the last thing I wanted to show you, was that everything you need to know about the poetry contest and how to even submit your poem is on this website as well. We have kind of guidelines for any student, and they can participate as a class, but let's say only a few people in your class actually want to submit their poems to the contest, that's totally fine. Or if you know a student who would want to do this on their own, they are welcome to. I've had grandparents contact me that they want to do it with their grandchildren, that they want to do it intergenerationally. And they were asking, do they have to be a teacher to be able to sign their children up? And I was like, not at all. We are, Joshua had asked, keeping it kind of 5th grade through 12th grade right now, but I'd also told him, because he's a mixed 4th, 5th grade class, that we would welcome 4th graders who are that excited. We're not going to turn away excited children who are writing poetry. And so I just wanted to show you a quick clip of some of those Hunter students who composed their poems and were the first submissions to our poetry contest. And just to preface this, they spent 2 days with us, only 2 days. One was a walking tour, one was an on-site visit, and then we came to their class and visited.
And they had some pre-lessons.
And they had some pre-lessons and they had a post-lesson, but they wrote the poems as homework. So just not that they spent like a month slaving over these poems, this was something that they did quite quickly. See if it'll let me go full screen.
Something about the context in which Emma Lazarus lived and wrote. It helps us to see what a remarkable poem it is and what one person can do to change the conversation.
So what we want you to do is think about an issue that's important to you and write about it.
If it's my
We want you to
computer.
respond to the question. If you could write a poem for the Statue of Liberty today, what would it be?
Okay, so we went to the American Jewish Historical Society and we learned all about Emma Lazarus and her poem called The New Colossus. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to think about what you want your message to be for newly arriving immigrants. Or the message.
I firmly believe that young people are ready and willing and completely able to stand on that pedestal and give us the new Emma Lazarus or the newly envisioned version of Emma Lazarus. We just have to listen.
For all her storied strength, Lady Liberty weeps as she stands, as what she symbolizes is crushed to dust in politicians' hands. Her people ignore her and refuse her protection, and allow her glistening beige skin to be tarnished by hate. They allow her hope to fade to a melancholy silence, and her skin to melt into muddy green, losing its shine.
Here your words are not twisted to insults, but crafted to songs. Here the mighty arguments of peace are indestructible. Our differences unify our love.
Well, let one thing be clear.
Sorry, everyone. Let's see. Okay, turn you up. Share. Share. Oh, yep.
For all her storied strength,
That's better.
Lady Liberty weeps as she stands, as what she symbolizes is crushed to dust in politicians' hands. Her people ignore her and refuse her protection, and allow her glistening beige skin to be tarnished by hate. They allow her hope to fade to a melancholy silence, and her skin to melt into muddy green, losing its shine.
Here your words are not twisted to insults, but crafted to songs. Here the mighty arguments of peace are indestructible. Our differences unify our love.
Well, let one thing be clear. We welcome you to enter here with open arms. Though some may allocate for you to fail, the foundation of this country will prevail. So fear not of what is unknown, and welcome to America, your newfound home.
talk.
Oh, okay.
Or you can also turn off the screen share if you want.
How do I do that?
If you go up to the top. Oh, yeah, mine just died.
Stop share?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep, so now you can just talk.
Hi again. So that is in the nutshell, the kind of the arc and the different arcs that you can take with the curriculum. I know a bunch of people kind of had questions as it was running that we haven't gotten to, but I want to see if you can ask them again and we can go into it. A few,
Okay, I can show you how to get to it.
oh, okay.
Or you can just keep going.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not a webinar expert. So one of the things too, as we're getting to the questions, today I was at the Statue of Liberty Museum, the brand new museum that opened in May, and I hadn't been, and it was interesting because of course, I'm thinking so much. I know that I am obsessed with Emma Lazarus, so I'm going to go into it and of course be like, oh, there's not enough about Emma Lazarus, but it struck me as so interesting. There was like an introductory film, and at the end they kind of talk about immigration, and don't quote the poem at all, like nothing, and it would have been so perfect there. It was just as weird because it was just garbled random word generic words, and it just would have been like to read the poem would have been perfect. And then in the actual exhibit there's a plaque, a replica of the plaque that was put on the statue's base in 1903. So when she wrote the poem, and you'll learn all this in the film and in the curriculum, but basically when she wrote the poem in 1883, she did so in order to raise money for the pedestal that the French had sent over this statue, and it was an auction to raise money for the pedestal, and it got a lot of attention at the time. But by the time the statue was put on the pedestal, it had kind of fallen into, people don't remember it, and she dies. And then later, a friend of hers in 1901 discovers the poem again in a bookshop, because Emma Lazarus was very well known at the time as a writer, just not really well known. The new Colossus didn't register. She was known for a writer of essays and poems and plays and other things. But a friend runs into this and says, we need to do something to memorialize her, and launches an effort to get the plaque put on. It was never in the statue, but it was inside the base of the Statue of Liberty. And it was disconcerting today because it was interesting. When I was at the museum, they had created the replica, and the museum is away. The new museum is not in the base of the statue. It used to be. So then I said, well, where is the plaque still where it was? And at first they didn't know. And then I went into the actual the statue platform, and they're like, oh, you can find it. You have to go to the old museum that no one's going to, because everyone now bypasses the old museum because the new museum exists. And so I saw this, so the plaque is still there, but it's like in this weird state where there's this like 1980s kind of exhibit, but a bunch of stuff has been taken out of it to be put into the new museum. And like literally right under the plaque, there was something else about Emma that was torn out. So you just see it was like it was like a museum that had been pillaged, and then the plaque was there, and it just struck me as so odd that no one's going to really see this plaque. So I feel like there still are conversations to be had about this poem and its connection to the statue, and how we want it to be connected. I think another thing that was important for us in creating this is that we want people to learn the poem, know about her time, be encouraged by her activism, but also be encouraged by the idea that the poem itself might not have all the answers. And so if we want the students to be writing about American identity today and what they see as an important poem today, that it's totally open for them to be putting other issues that they think maybe weren't addressed in the original poem in the poem. So we want to really open this to be a question about what is American identity and ideals, and immigration, of course, is a huge part of it because that's the core of this curriculum. Okay, so questions. There's a questions, will you differentiate the poetry contest depending on the grade? Yes, we'll probably do middle school and we'll do high school. Let's see if there's any questions. There's a lot of super helpful comments. Oh, and I also want to mention that Facing History is working with us too in different cities to incorporate this as part of professional development. So I want to welcome some of the folks from Facing History who I think are on here. You guys are awesome and have helped inspire a lot of kind of discussion questions that we are folding into the curriculum. Any new questions now that we've kind of gone over everything? Yeah, and come to our, oh, that's, Yeah, what is American? Someone, Natalie had written about what is American, and it's a central theme of migration studies. Exactly. What I think, and I think one of the discussion questions that we want to be integrating into this is this poem about immigration or is it about America? And what's the relationship between those two? But I think there's something, that poem that she's writing is about how Americans are going to define themselves as true Americans and idealistic Americans in how they respond to immigrants. So if they respond to immigrants in a kind of way that we're, give me your tired and your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, that will make America a better America. I think that's I think Emma Lazarus knew at the time that not everyone agreed with her interpretation, which is why the lightning's imprisoned, which is why, this is lips that are silent lips. But I think more broadly, she's putting forward this idea that America is still evolving and it's up to us to kind of do things. And so our kind of creation of this curriculum in the poetry contest is to say to students, be civic participants, like know the history, learn the history, and use the history as a prompt to kind of respond for what you think is going on today, centered around this question, as Natalie wrote, what is American? And the question that also came up is, which I think is really important from Shira, is that really the image we want to convey about immigrants, your tired, wretched refuse? That's a good, and that was actually when the poem was put on in 1903, there was an initiative to take that out. They changed the line and it didn't go through. But what Esther Shore, her biographer, and what others have said is that when she was using the word refuse, it was really the French refusee, so that the people who had been refused other words. So it wasn't about like literally calling immigrants trash, but it really was about people who had been refused from other places, which I think is but I think that line can be debated in class too. Like rather than everything I'm saying is just my interpretation at the moment. It doesn't really matter. What's important is what you're doing with your students. And in the film that we sent you, we didn't want to have a lot of talking heads. So you hear the voices of Esther Shore, her biographer. You hear Christina Greer, who's a political scientist who's written about African American and Caribbean American and African immigrants extensively, commenting and talking about it. But we showed the primary sources to privilege those. But you're hearing the voices of scholars who've been kind of thinking about this and raising the question.
And I just want to say that, Shira, that's been that question has been a great literary discussion, right? It's thinking about what do those words mean, and and as we think about immigration, past, present, right? What makes this poem so radical, as Molly pointed out earlier, right, is she's giving you an image of immigration, right, which may not be the same as who we think of when we're talking about immigration today, and who are the folks we want. So that contrast, that language, regardless of the meaning, as we, at the time, what are our ears? What do we hear? What are we hearing? And how does that contrast with the public debate? And maybe suggest a reframe for our own conversation.
Mm-hmm. There's an important question too about, did Emma ever speak out about the Chinese Exclusion Act? Since it's the same time period, exactly, it's 1882, and she writes a poem in 1883, and it's 1881, 1882 that she first gets involved with the work of helping the East European Jewish refugees who are arriving. We haven't found anything that she's written on that topic. That doesn't mean she didn't think about it or talk about it, but there's nothing recorded. But that's a part of the curriculum that we talk about, and Adam found some great sources for that we've woven in about how this is happening at the same time, and it helps kind of support this idea that she's living in a world where not everyone loves immigrants. And I think that is influencing also her writing of the poem. And I think one of the things that had also come up in the Cuccinelli thing in August was that I think he said she was only, he said, so I don't know if he said it, but it was implied, and certainly journalists wanted to put it forward as such, that she thought this was only for European immigrants, which is not true at all. I mean, if she didn't say, give me your tired and poor Jewish immigrants or Irish or Catholic, or she said immigrants. Like, she didn't specify any particular background, because I think that was the point. This was a kind of universal poem for all immigrants, whether they're from China, whether they're from Russia, whatever. That is the kind of the way she's doing it.
Shira brought up something great about Native Americans, Americans and their narrative fitting in.
Yeah, so Shira's point about America as a country of immigrants because this discounts the narrative of Native Americans and Africans who came here forcibly as slaves. Both aren't examples of immigrants and need to be remembered. What do you think about this? Have you had this conversation with schools? So I actually had this conversation with Christina Greer, who's an expert on a lot of this. And in the poem, in the film, she says, "Is this poem inclusive of every single issue that's come up in America? No, but it still has something to teach us." That said, right, so it's like, can we accept this poem? Can we accept the sentiments around it? For Christina Greer, what she found so compelling about the poem was that it was valorizing poverty. Like, you're not valorizing poverty, but saying like poverty is something that we need to help. Like, give me your tired.
Desirable.
Yes, and that's radical. So she thinks this is still a radical poem. And I think the question then we want to do, if we're being fully kind of, honest isn't the word because no one's being dishonest, but I think fully kind of engaging with this material is, to the extent that's possible, you know, talk about that with students and say, you've learned in other units about this and that. Does this poem include that? When you rewrite your poem, what would you say? In a way, not to basically, I think it would be problematic to say Emma Lazarus didn't care about these issues because she wrote about other issues in different places. And she couldn't in one poem, I think, be expected to deal with everything. But there's a really important history of the statue itself, which has been erased, or not erased. And the Statue of Liberty Museum does a really good job with this too, of talking about how when it was originally conceived by Laboulaye, who was a political theorist and thinker in France in the mid 1860s and 1870s, and then he gives this idea to Bartholdi, the statue maker, the sculptor, to put it into place. The original conception was that this is celebrating abolition and liberty and the end of abolition, or actually the end of slavery and the success of abolition. And I think that's something that can be woven into all of this as well.
But a lot of this, I would just say, I mean, is that the curriculum is really built to have these deeper and richer conversations, right? So the poem is the center of it, but really what we're trying to do is place it in its time and its historical context, and then allow us out, right? Go deep and then allow out, so we can really have these universal conversations. I want to pick up just really quickly before we step out on the other point that Shira raised, which is this nation of immigrants narrative. So I think that's an interesting conversation to be had, much broader than Emma Lazarus, because Emma Lazarus wasn't having that conversation. She wasn't talking about, you know, that's a frame that comes later. But it is true that, right, that when you talk about the nation of immigrants, there's stories that aren't there, as Annie said. But what you can do, and I think that this is important, and this relates to the frame I was giving at the beginning, is that I think when you get rid of the I am at the beginning, we are a nation and we are a world of people who have migrated. And that has not always been a story of choice. That's been a story of forced migration, is deeply tied to this country's history. At the very moment that the Pilgrims are getting on a boat to come to North America is when the first enslaved Africans are brought to this country. And those are stories of movement. The forced movement of migrations of American Indians are deeply tied to this country's history. As the way west people go, it's that same moment. So maybe it's trying to say I'm being too clever by taking the I am out, but I would suggest that we need to think very carefully about our language, and I don't think it's always meant to exclude, but by talking about a nation of immigrants, we do miss the story, but we're only a couple letters off from a broader conversation. So Annie, what are your last thoughts you'd like people to take away with?
Our last thoughts is that we want to partner with you and help make this curriculum accessible to your classroom and helpful to your classroom. And so we developed really great relationships with the teachers that we worked with, and each teacher kind of did it slightly differently and had different experiences, again, but all produced, you know, really cool work. So we really want to work with you and hear from you about kind of how you might incorporate this into your current work. And we're happy to talk to you on the phone and kind of hear where you are and help adapt this to you, because that's the whole point, is to get this material out of the archives and into the classrooms, and to get students to kind of understand that they too can help define and debate what it means to be American. So thank you so much for doing this on a weeknight when you're after teaching all day and doing all your work. We're really proud to have this opportunity and grateful to have this opportunity to work with you, and we look forward to working more.
Great. And the curriculum is on the American Jewish Historical Society's website. You'll find it there. You'll find links to it, who I haven't put up yet, from Reimagining Migration's website, and we'll make sure to share the link to the material actually right now as the webinar comes to an end. So thank you all for joining us. Annie, you look like you want to say one last thing.
I was just going to say, and feel free to just email us directly. My email is apolland@ajhs.org. So A, my last name, Polland, @ajhs.org. And then being typed, I guess. And Chelsea is cbracci@ajhs.org. And thank you so much. Good night. Thank you, Adam.
Night, y'all. Thanks so much, Annie. Thanks, Chelsea. And thank you all for hanging in there. Take care. Bye, y'all.